Okay, so I'm going to begin this recording. As you know, we are continuing our discussion of singular terms and the question of how singular terms are meaningful at all. And of course, in the background of that question about the foundational issue or in the background of that foundational question of meaning, we also have this idea that meaning is all about reference. So you know about RTM already. So in this recording, I want to begin with, again, a brief account of the history of analytic philosophy. So I have here a slide where I have the rough dates that correspond to certain important periods. So when we talk about this debate between Russell and Strawson and then later adjudicated by Donnellan, we are talking about something that began around 1900 to 1910. So what you have in the module page is a description of how Moore and Russell broke away from absolute idealism. So that began around that period, and it was initiated by these two people. By 1910, Bertrand Russell and Ludwig Wittgenstein began developing a view called logical atomism. Okay, so one way to explain logical atomism is that it's all about ideal language analysis. So the ambition or the goal, the transcendental goal of both Russell and Wittgenstein is to expose the structure of the world by analyzing language. And when they analyze language, especially Russell, but here we also include the early Wittgenstein, the Wittgenstein from this period, they wanted to analyze sentences. You know, you have seen the kind of sentences that Russell was interested in. He was obsessed with the word the, and he was analyzing things like the sentences like the present king of France is bald. And they wanted to show how the language can be analyzed to get rid of confusion, so that the words that ordinarily people use for everyday purposes is something confusing, and what you need is a kind of logical analysis to clear out all the debris, so to speak, to get rid of all the confusion. And the point of analyzing sentences is to expose the ideal structure of language itself, which eventually tells us something about the structure of the world, because for Russell and the early Wittgenstein, language pictures reality. One other way to say that is language represents reality. So the atomists were focusing on specific atoms. So the basic atom is a sentence. So you have a sentence like the cat is on the mat, or the author of Waverley is a Scotsman, and we will analyze that, get rid of all the confusion and the things that are misleading, and then we can expose what it's really about, and it will tell us how language represents and pictures the world. So the most important work from this period, so Russell and the early Wittgenstein are both descriptivists. So they are talking about linguistic function that is primarily about denoting. So that's the title of the classic paper by Bertrand Russell, where he talks about the importance of puzzle solving in philosophy. And for Russell, the point of this analysis or thinking about language is about showing how it captures what's going on in the world, or what is described in the Tractatus as what is the case, right? So what reality is like, right? And the most important work from that period is Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, one of the very few, if not the only book written during a war. So Wittgenstein was born in Vienna. He was an Austrian citizen, especially near the beginning, before World War II. And he fought as a soldier in World War I. And the the story is that he had the copy of the Tractatus in his notebook. It was in his backpack, and he was like in the trenches while shelling and all sorts of things were going on. And he was thinking about philosophy. He was writing about the relationship between language and the world. Now, after Wittgenstein wrote the Tractatus, he showed it to people, especially Russell, and people were so impressed. It really captures, crystallizes in very pristine form what this view, logical atomism, is all about. And then a lot of people were very taken with the Tractatus, meaning they admired it so much and they liked it so much, and they started doing philosophy following that framework, following that strategy. And a new view, logical positivism, emerged. So logical positivism is something that we will discuss more later in this course, in later modules. But for the logical positivists, they were also like the atomists. The logical positivists also viewed ordinary language, or the language of ordinary people, as something like confused and is misleading, and we cannot properly philosophize using that, so we must do something. So they have a prescriptive approach to language. And then later on, around World War II, an entirely new approach to philosophical analysis emerged, and here we have the later Wittgenstein. So Wittgenstein, like I said, is one of the interesting figures here, where he's associated with all these people. Technically, Wittgenstein was not part of the Vienna Circle that comprised the core of logical positivism. But all these people, Ayer and other members of the Vienna Circle, were great admirers of the early Wittgenstein, or how they understood Wittgenstein. But Wittgenstein himself, I don't think it's appropriate or it's accurate to say that he was a logical positivist. So itong ordinary language philosophy, dumating na dito na kaya ordinary language. So it marks the beginning of a time when philosophers started to say, look, it's not about making ordinary language more logical. We're not prescribing anything here. We're not trying to change how language functions. Right? So one slogan for ordinary language philosophy, which comes from a remark in the philosophical investigations, goes something like this. It's a very typical view from the later Wittgenstein. Here's the slogan: everything is in order as it is. Right? So meaning language is fine. We don't have to change it. We don't have to prescribe how people use it so that it's more logical, so that there is the ideal relationship between linguistic terms and the world that is properly expressed. And later on, this whole business of analyzing terms became more specialized. It branched out. The ordinary language philosophy was very fashionable for like a couple of decades, and there was actually a backlash against that, I think, after the mid-60s. And people in the beginning, people were like really admiring Wittgenstein of the philosophical investigations, and then later on they were kind of reacting to it in a negative way, like hating it. But all the business of analysis remained, and this analysis is turned to concepts. Later, the analysis is directed to concepts with current and socio-political issues. So if you can look at the work, for example, that we will look at later, like the work of the philosopher Sally Haslanger, where she uses a kind of philosophical analysis that is descended from the tradition that began here, in the way that Moore and Russell broke away from absolute idealism. But this time, it is not just about ivory tower pursuits like finding the ideal language and getting rid of the debris that is confusing. But Haslanger is interested in something that she calls an ameliorative approach. So this is a basic idea where philosophical analysis is not just used for like picking apart a concept so we can break it down to its components and understand it better, but more in the direction of conceptual engineering. How should we understand and revise our understanding of certain concept so that we can change the way certain things in the world are going? I think one of the most prominent examples of how Haslanger's ameliorative approach is used is visible in the work of Kate Mann, who famously gave an ameliorative analysis of the term misogyny. So if you look at, some of you are probably familiar with the work of Kate Mann and her whole idea about misogyny. So the book is called Down Girl, and that is actually the analysis of the term misogyny, that it is the police force of the patriarchy. It is essentially a move that puts women down and relegates them to subordinate positions so that the patriarchy is able to maintain supremacy, so that a certain status quo is preserved. Okay, so all that by way of saying this old tradition about analysis, it has this deep history, and some parts of the debate from many decades ago are something that we're going to go through, but our interest is in really learning the style and the way of proceeding that is initiated by this sequence of events. So sometimes some people today talk about post-analytic philosophy. I think some people are interested in devising the phrase or the portmanteau word post-analytic as an analog or like a parallel to postmodernism. And one person who's associated with this tendency to talk about post-analytic philosophy, or what happened to analytic philosophy after all that, all the earlier things that happened even before World War I, even before World War I and shortly after World War II, we have Richard Rorty. Right? So Richard Rorty says, post-analytic philosophy is described here as a detachment from the mainstream philosophical movement of analytic philosophy, and it mainly derives from contemporary American philosophers. And by contemporary American philosophers, we usually no longer mean people who are still around. Most of these people have actually died in the last decade and a half. And Rorty here encapsulates the essential goal of post-analytic philosophy. He says, I think that analytic philosophy can keep its highly professional methods, the insistence on details and mechanics, and just drops its transcendental project. I'm not out to criticize analytic philosophy as a style. I think it's a good style. But I think what he does not say is that we retain the style, but we give up on the transcendental ambition, the idea that we can expose the nature of reality itself or language itself, that there is such a structure to be exposed. Okay, so we are kind of roughly moving in the direction of understanding how this post-analytic philosophy or post-analytic approach emerged, more specifically in the discussion having to do with language. So, like I said, or like I have been saying, one of the primary figures here, if not the primary figure in philosophy of language, is Ludwig Wittgenstein. So this is I have here a slide with a picture of the man and the dates that encapsulate his life, and the last thesis in the Tractatus, which is very famous, that whereof we cannot speak, thereof we must be silent. It has been adopted in the country by some Filipino philosophers. For instance, si Ferriols, parang isinasali niya ito, pero iba yung paggamit ni Ferriols dito, walang kinalaman sa philosophy of language. Pero yung baka narinig nyo na yung kapag nasabi na ang lahat ng masasabi, ang pinakamahalaga, hindi masasabi. So actually, the Tractatus ends with this statement, and some people interpret this to mean, let's not talk about nonsense. Let's not talk about all the things that are not fully, consistently logical. Let's just be completely silent about that. Let's just not waste words our breath or ink on paper on such things. That's the interpretation of the sentence of the claim that logical positivists took. So we must just get rid of all the things that we cannot speak about because they're all nonsense. Others interpret this statement as a kind of mysticism, that there is such a thing as the ineffable, yung hindi masasabi, yung hindi kayang makahon sa wika. Kahit na gaano ka pa kagaling, umintindi, at magsalita at gumamit ng wika, may mga bagay, may mga nangyayari na hindi kayang kahunin sa mga salita. So those are kind of two very different interpretations of Wittgenstein, and well, we might have a reason to go back to that later, but now after I have okay, let me just check the time. Now that I have explained the history and how it relates to us, right? So in the beginning, we have Wittgenstein, who was developing, or who developed logical atomism, and he was basically saying the first line of the Tractatus is the world is all that is the case. What's going on in the world, it is just what it is. It is completely mind independent. So when we have sentences aspire to picturing atoms of reality, like parts of reality, like this cat is on this mat. It is raining on this particular day, at this particular time, at this particular location. So one ambition of logical atomism is just to compile all true propositions, because if we do that, then we will have some grasp of what is the case, what's happening in the world itself, right? But that's kind of the big picture project. As you know, we are at this point just focusing on singular terms. And maybe even if we bracket or set aside this transcendental project of the logical atomists, we can say, well, maybe even just one part of language works like a description, right? So to understand that, I will present what I will call an inconsistent